Korean billionaire wasn't understood by anyone in the meeting, until the cleaner's daughter spoke Korean, and everyone was left speechless. Calvin hated variables. His life, his career, and the multi-billion-dollar empire of Magnus Enterprises were built on eradicating them. He lived by data, projections, and schedules that ran with the precision of a Swiss watch. Variables were the enemy, and on that Tuesday morning, he was surrounded by them, trapped in a glass room on the 40th floor with the air growing thinner by the second. The biggest variable was sitting across the immense mahogany table. Mr. Jun-Ho Han wasn't just a potential business partner, he was a legend. A man who had turned a modest electronics component company into a global conglomerate as an SL Tech, with a reputation for relentless innovation and uncompromising quality. Mr. Han was known for his almost infinite patience for perfection and his zero tolerance for incompetence. Calvin had spent the last 18 months proving that Magnus was not just competent, but the ideal partner for SOL Tech's expansion into the Western market. 18 months of trans-Pacific flights, formal dinners, late-night conference calls, and exhaustive market analyses. It all came down to these 90 minutes. And the interpreter, the most crucial piece of the puzzle, the human bridge between two powerhouses, didn't show up. "Anything yet?" Calvin muttered into his lapel communicator, keeping a strained smile on his face as Mr. Han examined a projections chart with an indecipherable expression. "I'm trying everything, Cal," came the tense voice of his executive assistant, Patricia, in his ear. "I called the agency. They're in a panic. Their emergency backup is stuck in traffic on the other side of the city. I've called the consulate, the Chamber of Commerce. On such short notice, it's impossible. No one trustworthy is available. Keep trying," he ordered, his voice low and sharp as a knife. He ended the communication and turned his attention back to Mr. Han, who was now placing the paper on the table and looking directly at him. The silence that followed was not contemplative, it was a verdict. The meeting had been underway for 25 torturous minutes. The first 5 were filled with awkward pleasantries, smiles and nods. The next 20 were a dive into modern technology hell. Calvin's translation app, which cost a small fortune in annual subscriptions, turned his careful explanation of optimized supply chain logistics into a happy, fast delivery truck. Mr. Han, in turn, tried using his own device, which translated a complex question about intellectual property protection as, "Where does your idea sleep at night?" It was a disaster, an insult to both their intelligences. Technology, instead of uniting them, only highlighted the chasm between them, mocking their efforts with every poorly translated phrase. Mr. Han was a man of few words, but his actions were eloquent. He discreetly aligned his pen perfectly parallel to his leather briefcase. He took a sip of water, placing the glass back on the coaster with millimeter precision, making no sound. These were the gestures of a man who had made a decision and was now just going through the formalities before leaving. He looked out the window at the city sprawling below, his mind clearly already elsewhere. On his next flight, in his next meeting, far away from here, panic, an emotion Calvin despised and rarely felt, began to rise in his throat like bile. He could feel the stares of his team, 2 VPs and a lawyer, burning into his back. They were expecting him, the leader, the visionary, to do something, to pull a rabbit out of the hat, but the hat was empty. "Mr. Han," Calvin said, his voice a little louder than he intended. He gestured toward the documents scattered on the table, a pleading look on his face. The potential is enormous." The Korean billionaire turned his gaze back to Calvin. There was no anger in his eyes, not even disappointment. There was something worse, a kind of polished resignation. He saw an unprepared opponent, and in Mr. Han's world, being unprepared was the cardinal sin. He gave Calvin a slight nod, a farewell gesture, and placed his hands on the arms of his chair, preparing to stand. The sound of his leather chair creaking was, to Calvin, the sound of failure. Meanwhile, 3 floors below, in a small break room reserved for staff, Zoe was bored. Her mother, Diana, had set her up there with a drawing pad and a brand new box of colored pencils. "Stay here and be a good girl, sweetie," Diana had said, her voice soft but with a hint of pleading. "Mommy has to work very hard today. Promise you won't leave." Zoe promised, and for almost an hour she kept it. She drew her mom with bright blonde hair like the sun. She drew a dog she wanted to have. She drew the characters from her favorite K-drama, the ones she watched with her mom every night. But now the pencils seemed dull, and the paper static. The break room smelled of old coffee and cleaning products. She could hear the sounds of the building. The hum of computers, the distant ring of a phone, the soft whir of her mother's cart rolling down the marble hallway. But there was another sound, a sound coming from above. It was low, a murmur of voices. She couldn't understand the words, but she could feel the tone. It was like the tense scenes in her shows, when two characters were about to fight or make a very important decision. It was interesting. The promise she made to her mother still echoed in her mind, but curiosity was a much more powerful force. Sliding off the chair, she tiptoed to the door and peeked out. The hallway was empty. The sound was coming from the private elevator at the end of the hall, the one her mother said was only for the big bosses. The elevator door was ajar, blocked by a service latch. Without a second thought, she slipped through the door and up the service stairs, following the sound of the voices that grew clearer and clearer. She emerged into a quiet, luxurious hallway, with a carpet so soft her feet sank into it. Ahead of her, a large, dark wooden door was slightly ajar. That was where the tension was coming from. With the heart of an explorer, she approached and peeked through the crack. The movement at the door was what caught Calvin's attention, a small disturbance in the corner of his eye. He hoped it was Patricia with some last-minute miracle, but the figure that slipped in was too small, too quiet. A little blonde girl, in a simple dress that looked like a splash of color in a monochromatic world of suits and formalities, stopped just inside the entrance. Calvin's brain stopped working for a second. The incongruity of the scene was total. It was like seeing a penguin in the desert. Mr. Han saw her too, and his movement to stand up halted midway. The entire room held its breath. The girl, Zoe, ignored the stares of all the adults, her bright, intelligent blue eyes fixed on Mr. Han's face. She saw the tightness in his jaw, the slight frown of frustration between his eyebrows, the way he held his briefcase like a shield. She recognized that expression. It was the same one the main character in Heir of Destiny made right before calling off a deal. Then she opened her mouth and spoke, a short, clear sentence in Korean. The melody of her childish voice was so shocking in that environment that it sounded like the chime of a crystal bell in an iron foundry. The effect on Mr. Han was immediate. The mask of impassivity shattered, replaced by absolute shock. His eyes widened. He slowly leaned back in his chair, his mouth slightly open. He looked at his own executives, as if to confirm they were also seeing and hearing the same thing. They were, and they looked equally stunned. He replied, his deep voice a mixture of question and disbelief. Zoe listened, then turned to Calvin, who still looked like a statue. "He asked who I am," she said, with the casualness of someone commenting on the weather. "I told him I'm the person who's going to help you talk." Calvin blinked. The simplicity and audacity of the answer snapped him out of his stupor. Tell him I apologize for the confusion," Calvin managed to say, his mind racing, trying to recalibrate all of reality. Zoe translated. Mr. Han responded, this time with a longer sentence. "Then he said apologies don't fix a lack of preparation," Zoe reported. "He said the foundation of a partnership is trust, and trust begins with clear communication." The translation was perfect, not just in the words, but in the weight, the formality. It was the essence of Mr. Han's objection, something no app could capture. "Tell him he is absolutely right," Calvin replied, feeling adrenaline replace the panic. A chance, he had a chance. "And tell him that using this unexpected opportunity to find a creative solution is the ultimate proof that our partnership can overcome any obstacle." The back and forth began. The meeting, which had been dead, was resurrected in a way no one could have predicted. Zoe was the channel. She stood between the two ends of the table, turning from one CEO to the other, a small beacon of communication. She didn't just translate, she interpreted. When Calvin used a complicated technical term about agnostic software platforms, she frowned, thought for a second, and then said something in Korean that made Mr. Han smile and nod. "What did you say?" Calvin asked, fascinated. "That your program works with any kind of computer, even the old ones," she explained. She transformed corporate jargon into simple truths. She disarmed the tension with her presence. At one point, Mr. Han asked her a question directly in Korean, in a softer tone. She answered, laughing. "He asked me where I learned to speak so well," she told Calvin. "I told him that the villains in K-dramas always speak very clearly when they're explaining their evil plans." The entire room, including Mr. Han, laughed. The ice didn't just break, it completely melted. From that moment on, they were no longer two companies negotiating a contract. They were just people in a room, talking, with the help of an extraordinary 7-year-old girl. When the signatures were on the paper, the atmosphere was light, almost festive. Mr. Han shook Calvin's hand with renewed vigor. "You were right, Mr. Calvin," he said, as Zoe translated. "Your company is indeed very good at finding creative solutions." He then knelt in front of Zoe, a gesture of respect that shocked everyone. "You have a gift, young lady. Never let anyone tell you otherwise." He took a small pin from his lapel, the SOL tech symbol in gold and platinum, and handed it to her. "A small thank you for your help." When the Korean delegation finally left, Calvin's team erupted in murmurs of disbelief. He dismissed them, needing a moment to process the whirlwind of events. Alone in the room with Zoe, he watched her look at the small pin in her hand. "That was the most incredible thing I have ever seen," he said, his voice full of admiration. He crouched down in front of her. "Where's your mother, Zoe?" Before she could answer, the door flew open. Diana stood there, her face a mask of terror. The frantic search for her daughter, from the break room to the restrooms to the cafeteria, had left her breathless and her heart pounding in her throat. Seeing Zoe safe and sound, in the main boardroom with the CEO, the most powerful man in the building, was the worst-case scenario she could imagine. "Sir! Oh my God, forgive me! I am so sorry!" she gasped, rushing to her daughter's side and pulling her close. The words stumbled over each other in her desperate haste. I told her to be quiet. "I was only gone for a minute. Please, I'm begging you, don't fire me. I'll do anything. I'll clean the bathrooms on every floor. Please, I need this job. It's all I have." Tears welled up in her blue eyes, tears of pure, absolute fear. She was bracing for the blow, for the anger, for the inevitable dismissal. Calvin stood up slowly, giving her a moment for the torrent of panic to subside. He looked at the woman before him, at the genuine fear on her face, and felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. "Diana?" he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. She stopped, shocked that he knew her name. "Breathe," he said. "It's okay. You're not getting fired." She stared at him, confusion beginning to replace the fear. "In fact," Calvin continued, a faint smile forming on his lips for the first time that day, "I don't think I've ever been so grateful for a child not obeying her mother in my entire life. Your daughter didn't interrupt anything. She saved everything." He briefly explained what had happened, the words sounding absurd even to him as he said them. Diana listened, her jaw dropped, her mind spinning in a futile attempt to comprehend. Her Zoe, her quiet little girl who drew cartoon characters. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You don't have to understand right now," Calvin said, "but I would like to talk with both of you, when you have time." The phrase, "when you have time," spoken by a man whose time was measured in thousands of dollars per minute, was the most disorienting thing of all. Diana, a woman accustomed to stepping around people so as not to be in the way, to being less than a shadow, suddenly found herself in the spotlight. The floor seemed to have disappeared from under her feet. She could only nod, unable to form a single word. Beside her, protected by her mother's embrace and oblivious to the revolution she had just caused, Zoe looked at the shiny pin in her hand. Then she looked up at Calvin, and with a wisdom that seemed far beyond her years, she smiled. The summons came on Tuesday. For Calvin, it was the next logical step in a puzzle that had occupied his mind for 48 hours, eclipsing quarterly projections and a looming patent dispute. For Diana, the message from Patricia, Calvin's executive assistant, was a sentence. The language was polite. "Mr. Calvin would like to see you both in his office at 10 in the morning, if that's convenient." But to a woman who spent her nights cleaning up executives' trash, the word convenient sounded like a euphemism for unavoidable. She spent the night in an anxious waking state, the hum of the old refrigerator in her small apartment marking the hours. What would she say? The truth seemed insane, a confession of negligence that would surely result in her termination. A lie, however, felt fragile, bound to shatter under the analytical gaze of a man like Calvin. In the end, as the grey morning sun filtered through the window, she had no plan, only a deep weariness and the small hand of her daughter in hers. The journey to the 40th floor was like ascending to the gallows. The employees who passed them in the pristine hallways, with their expensive suits and focused gazes, seemed to belong to another species. Diana pulled the cardigan she wore over her plainest blouse, feeling terribly exposed. She was used to navigating these spaces like a ghost during the silence of the night. To be seen in broad daylight, under the scrutiny of power, was unsettling. Calvin's office was exactly like the man, restrained, precise, and expensive. The glass walls offered a panoramic view of the city that seemed to stretch to infinity, a constant reminder of how high he was and how low she felt. But there was no ostentation. Just clean-lined designer furniture, shelves filled with books on economics and engineering, and a silence that seemed to be the sound of control itself. Calvin greeted them standing, his jacket off, a calculated gesture to lower the barrier of authority. He led them to a small set of armchairs away from his main desk, a space designed for conversation, not interrogation. On a low coffee table, a pad of drawing paper and a box of colored pencils were waiting. Upon seeing the pencils, Zoe let go of her mother's hand and approached, treating the CEO's office as if it were her private classroom. The girl's naturalness only accentuated Diana's rigidity, who sat on the edge of her armchair, her back as straight as a ruler. "Thank you for coming," Calvin said, his calm voice filling the silence. "I imagine these last few days have been confusing." Diana just nodded, unable to form a reply. "I'd like to get straight to the point," he continued, sitting across from her. "What Zoe did in the boardroom wasn't just a party trick. It was a demonstration of a skill I have never seen before." "I'm not angry, Diana. I'm perplexed, and I need to understand." The sincerity in his tone was the key that unlocked Diana's resolve. She looked at the man before her, not as a boss or a threat, but as someone genuinely seeking an answer. And the only answer she had was the truth. The shame and fear that had accompanied her for 2 years receded, replaced by a wave of steadfastness. "She was here, sir, because I had nowhere else to leave her," Diana said. Her voice, to her own surprise, did not tremble. "I bring her to work with me every day. I hide her in break rooms and empty storage closets. I know it's against the rules. I know it's dangerous. But it was the only way to survive." With an emotionless clarity, she painted the picture of her life. The husband who one day decided that freedom was more appealing than family, disappearing and leaving behind not just a broken heart, but an abyss of fraudulent debt in her name. The struggle to keep the apartment, the threatening calls from collectors, the selling of her belongings piece by piece until almost nothing was left. "Taking Zoe out of preschool was the hardest decision of my life," she admitted, her voice finally carrying a trace of the pain she felt. "I felt like a failure as a mother. But the tuition or the rent? Food on the table or a classroom? For me, the choice was clear." She met Calvin's gaze, expecting to see pity or, worse, disdain. Instead, she saw focused attention, an intensity that said he was absorbing every word, not as a sad story, but as a set of data explaining the situation. "So I did what I had to do," Diana concluded, protective pride now evident. And don't think she isn't learning. She never stops. We go to the library. She reads everything, devours books. She's brilliant." "I have no doubt about that," Calvin said, his voice soft. "The question isn't her intelligence. It's the specificity of her skill, the Korean Diana. You don't learn that in a library. That requires a teacher. Immersion." Diana sighed, almost a humorless laugh. Her teacher was the television. Her immersion was our little apartment, night after night. She explained how, in a desperate attempt to find something that would keep a 5-year-old busy for hours on end, she had stumbled upon a streaming service with an endless catalogue of Korean cartoons. They were colorful, loud, and most importantly, captivating. Zoe was hooked. "At first, I barely paid attention," Diana said. "It was just background noise while I paid bills or made dinner. But then things started to get strange. Zoe started humming the songs, then repeating whole phrases with perfect pronunciation. One day, I found her drawing notebooks. Between a unicorn and a castle, there were pages and pages of Korean characters, drawn with frightening precision. She described the shock of realizing her daughter wasn't just watching, but studying. She never asked me anything, never said, "Mom, teach me Korean." She just absorbed it, on her own. The words, "on her own," were the heart of the mystery for Calvin. He was a product of the world's best educational systems. He believed in methodology, in curricula, in guided instruction. The idea that a mind, especially a child's, could autonomously decode such a complex linguistic structure from material as chaotic as cartoons defied logic. He needed proof. "Zoe," he called gently. The girl looked up from her drawing, a vibrant world of dragons and stars. "Your mum told me about the cartoons you watch." "They're cool," she said with a nod. "I believe it," Calvin smiled. He gestured to the large monitor on his desk. "Do you mind if I show you something?" With the curiosity of a child who knows no fear, Zoe came closer. Diana followed, her heart pounding. Calvin opened a browser and went to the website of one of Seoul's largest newspapers. He clicked on a feature story, a dense article about the city's infrastructure policy, and enlarged the text. "Can you recognize anything here?" he asked, keeping his voice casual. Zoe tilted her head, her blue eyes scanning the lines of text. To Diana, it looked like an impenetrable code. To Zoe, it was familiar territory. "This one," she said, tapping the screen with her finger, "is mayor. And this one, promise. And this is bridge," she continued, jumping from word to word. "The whole story is about the mayor promising to build a new bridge for the citizens." Diana felt the air leave her lungs. She knew her daughter was special, but the extent of her ability was a universe she was only now beginning to glimpse. Seeing Zoe read a newspaper in a foreign language with the same ease she read her storybooks was shocking, almost frightening. Calvin leaned back in his chair, a million questions running through his mind. The ability was real, undeniable. But the how was still an enigma. "That's more than amazing, Zoe," he said, the admiration in his voice unmistakable. He crouched down to look her in the eyes. "But reading is only part of it. In the meeting, you knew what the words meant. You understood the emotion behind them. How did you do that?" Zoe thought for a moment, searching her young mind for the words to describe a process that, to her, was as natural as breathing. "It's like a big jigsaw puzzle," she said finally. "The subtitles are the straight pieces, the edge ones. They give you the shape." "And how do you find the middle pieces?" Calvin asked, captivated by the analogy. "With the pictures," she replied, her eyes shining with the simplicity of the logic. "The same word shows up all the time, but the picture behind the word changes. For example, the word for promise appears. The first time, the hero is smiling at the princess. His drawing is happy, his body is relaxed. So Auntie Promisag is a good thing." She paused, gathering her thoughts. But then, the villain says the same word, promise, to his henchman, but the drawing of his face is mean, his eyes are small and squinty. The subtitle is the same, but the picture is different. So I learned that promise can be two things, a good one and a dangerous one. Calvin was absolutely still, absorbing the revelation. She wasn't learning words, she was learning patterns of context. It's all about the repeats, Zoe concluded, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. I watch the same scene again and again. I look at the subtitle, then at the faces, the hands, how the characters stand. If you look long enough, the pictures always tell you the secret behind the words. The secret. There it was. She had deciphered the code of human communication. Alone, in a small apartment, with a cheap streaming package as her only teacher, she had developed a method of contextual data analysis that would be the envy of any artificial intelligence program. She saw language not as a set of rules, but as a living ecosystem of text or image or and emotion. He looked at Diana, who was now staring at her daughter with a mixture of love and utter amazement, as if seeing her for the first time. And he looked at Zoe, the little systems analyst who saw the world as a puzzle to be solved. The desire he had felt on the day of the meeting, the vague urge to do something, now seemed like a small and ill-defined ambition. What he felt now was a clarity of purpose. This wasn't a case of charity, it was a case of investing in the rarest of resources, human potential in its purest and most extraordinary form. To let that mind languish, without the tools, the resources, and the opportunities to flourish, would not just be a shame, it would be a monumental failure. And Calvin was a man who had built his entire life on the foundation of never, ever failing. The weeks that followed the revelation in Calvin's office unfolded at a new, hesitant pace. Diana's routine didn't change. She still arrived before dawn and left long after most employees went home, with Zoe in tow. What changed was the frequency with which her intercom would buzz, with the calm voice of Patricia, the CEO's assistant. Diana, Mr. Calvin is wondering if Zoe could spend some time in his office this afternoon. He found a sketchpad he thinks she'll like. At first, the invitations were sporadic and always came with a professional pretext. Calvin told himself he was just observing a phenomenon. Zoe's mind was a fascinating system, a learning algorithm that he, as a man of logic and business, felt the need to understand. It was a project, an intellectual curiosity. He clung to this justification because the alternative, that he simply enjoyed the company of a 7-year-old girl, seemed too absurd and sentimental for him. The conversations between them became the most unpredictable and strange part of Calvin's day. Zoe would settle into a corner of his office, in a small space that gradually became hers, with a stack of high-quality paper and colored pencils he had bought. As she drew, she talked. And unlike every adult in Calvin's life, she had no filter. One afternoon he was on the phone, finalizing a hostile negotiation with a competitor, his voice hard and his words sharp. As he hung up, feeling the bitter taste of corporate battle, Zoe was watching him with her big blue eyes. "You don't sound happy," she said, matter-of-factly. Calvin was taken aback. "It's not about happiness, Zoe. It's business." "But why do business if it doesn't make you happy?" she asked. A childish logic so simple it was impossible to refute. He was left without an answer. In 20 years of his career, no one had ever asked him that question. People asked about profit margins, market share, growth strategies. No one asked about happiness. Her question hung in the air, uncomfortable and strangely profound. On another occasion, she saw him looking at the model of a new residential complex that Magnus Enterprises was building. It was an ambitious project, an architectural gem that would earn him millions. "It's pretty," Zoe said, approaching the model. "They look like dollhouses." "It's our biggest project of the year," Calvin said with pride. "Are the people who will live there going to be happy?" she asked, gently touching the roof of one of the small buildings. The question blindsided him. He thought about construction costs, delivery deadlines, return on investment. The happiness of the future residents was an abstraction, a selling point for the marketing team, not a metric he considered. He realized, seen with a growing discomfort, that he had no idea what the answer was. Zoe was like that, direct, sensitive, and often unintentionally funny. Her observations were like little arrows of truth that pierced the armor Calvin had built around himself. She didn't try to be profound, she just was. With Diana, the interaction was completely different. The exchange between them remained in the safe territory of respect and formality. When she came to pick up Zoe at the end of the day, the conversation was brief and focused on the girl. Was she well behaved? Diana would ask, concern still visible on her face. She was perfect, as always, Calvin would reply. Today she explained to me why dragons shouldn't be afraid of water. Diana would give him a small smile, a glimpse of warmth amidst her usual exhaustion. She has a lot of theories, she would say, taking her daughter's hand. Thank you for looking after her, sir. It's a pleasure, Diana. And that was it. The conversation rarely went further. But in these brief encounters, something subtle happened. A shared glance over Zoe's head as she showed off a drawing. A moment of comfortable silence as they watched the girl put away her pencils with meticulous care. There was no tension, no clear dynamic of boss and employee. There were just two people connected by an extraordinary child, existing in a small bubble of calm in the middle of a hectic day. Calvin began to look forward to these moments. Diana's arrival in the late afternoon became a landmark in his day. He would find himself glancing at the clock, waiting for the soft sound of the door opening. He didn't understand why. This new dynamic in his life was a piece of data he couldn't analyze. He tried to apply logic to it. Perhaps it was a sense of responsibility. He had discovered Zoe's talent, therefore it was his duty to ensure she was safe. Or maybe it was curiosity, the same drive that propelled him in business, but the feeling was deeper, less intellectual. It was a desire, an inexplicable urge to be near them. He realized it on a Thursday night. A fierce storm was battering the city, and he stayed late at the office, watching the rain stream down the glass wall. The office was silent, immaculate, just the way he had always liked it. But for the first time, the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt empty. His gaze fell on Zoe's corner. There was a forgotten sheet of paper on the small table. He picked it up. It was a drawing of him, Diana, and Zoe holding hands under a smiling sun. In the drawing, he was a stick figure with spiky hair and, surprisingly, a big smile. He traced the line of the smile with his finger. In that moment, he stopped trying to understand. He stopped trying to put a label on it, responsibility, curiosity, project. He simply accepted the feeling, a warmth that had settled in his chest over the past few weeks, a sense that something important was missing from his life, and that, somehow, he had found it in the presence of a struggling mother and her brilliant daughter. He didn't know why he felt this attraction, this urge to be close. He only knew it was real, and he knew that passive observation was no longer enough. The desire to just be near was turning into a need to act. He didn't have a plan yet, but for the first time in a long time, he felt he was moving in a direction not dictated by a spreadsheet or a market report. It was a direction dictated by something much simpler and infinitely more bewildering. The summons for the meeting arrived on a Monday morning. Unlike the informal invitations of the previous weeks, this one came via a formal email from Patricia, with the subject line, "Meeting with Calvin Magnus." The formality sent a chill through Diana's body. The truce, she thought, was over. The pleasant conversations, Zoe's drawings, all of it had been a prelude to what was coming now, the consequences. With a heavy heart, she prepared herself and her daughter for what she imagined was the end of the line. When they entered the office, the atmosphere felt different. Calvin was behind his large mahogany desk, a position of power he hadn't used with them in weeks. The gesture hit her like a confirmation of her worst fears. He looked serious, and the air was charged with a gravity that made Diana hold Zoe's hand tighter. "Diana, Zoe, please have a seat," he said, his voice neutral. As Zoe settled in with her pencils, oblivious to the tension, Diana sat on the edge of her chair, her hands sweating, waiting for the blow. Calvin steepled his fingers on the desk, his gaze fixed on Diana. "I asked you here today for a formal conversation, because what I have to say is of a professional nature and of great importance to this company." Diana swallowed hard, bracing herself. "Over the past few weeks, I've had the opportunity to observe your daughter's extraordinary talent. he continued. But I want to be absolutely clear that what I'm about to say is not based on sentiment or charity. It is based on facts and a deep sense of professional debt. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Diana, he said, bluntly, the truth is this. The contract with SOL Tech, the biggest deal in this company's history, was only closed because of your daughter. Without her intervention that day, the deal would have collapsed. That is a fact. The value she generated for Magnus Enterprises is immeasurable, in the hundreds of millions of dollars. In any other circumstance, a consultant who delivered such a result would receive a substantial reward. Zoe, even unintentionally, was the most effective consultant this company has ever had. Diana stared, completely dumbfounded. She had expected a reprimand, a firing, perhaps a lecture on company policy. Instead, she was listening to the CEO quantify the market value of her 7-year-old daughter. I don't know what to say, sir, she stammered. She's just a child. She didn't mean any harm. I know, Calvin interrupted, his voice softening. She didn't mean any harm or any good. She was simply herself. And in doing so, she saved the future of this company. And gratitude, in the business world, should be demonstrated in a tangible way. That is why, after careful analysis, I would like to present a proposal. He stood up, walked around the desk, and sat in the armchair across from her, breaking the barrier of authority. The formality was over. Now, the conversation was personal. I understand your situation, Diana, because you had the courage to tell me, and the current situation is not sustainable. Not for you, and especially not for a child with Zoe's potential. So I want to offer a solution, a 3-part solution. He looked her directly in the eyes, ensuring she understood the seriousness of his offer. First, the debts, he said with a calm firmness. The financial burden you carry prevents any chance of stability. Anxiety and fear are not a conducive environment for raising a child. Starting tomorrow, the finance department of Magnus Enterprises will contact all of your creditors. We will settle every penny of the debt your ex-husband left in your name. Consider it a signing bonus paid to Zoe for the service she provided. Tears instantly sprang to Diana's eyes. The crushing weight she carried on her shoulders every day, every hour, every minute. The idea that it could simply disappear seemed like an impossible fantasy. Second, Zoe's education, Calvin continued, not giving her time to fully process the first shock. A gift like hers needs to be nurtured. She needs teachers who can challenge her, an environment that fosters her curiosity. Keeping Zoe out of school is not an option. I've done some research and selected the top 3 private schools in the city. I want you to visit them and choose the one you like best. Magnus Enterprises will establish an educational fund to cover all of Zoe's expenses, from enrollment through university. Now the tears were flowing freely down Diana's face. She brought a hand to her mouth, a silent sob shaking her body. The guilt she felt for not being able to give her daughter a proper education was an open wound in her soul. Calvin's offer wasn't just money. It was the healing of her greatest pain as a mother. And third, he said, his tone even gentler, none of this works if you continue to be on the verge of exhaustion, working shifts that keep you away from your daughter. You need a career, not just a job. There's an opening in our administrative department. The work involves organization, logistics, communication, skills that I believe you possess. The salary is triple what you currently earn, and most importantly, the hours are flexible, 9 to 3. You'll be able to drop Zoe off and pick her up from school every day. It was the final piece that completely broke Diana's dam of contained emotions. It wasn't charity. It was an opportunity, a real job, a chance at dignity, to be more than the invisible cleaner. It was a whole new life being offered to her on a platter. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out, only a choked sound. The relief was so overwhelming, so absolute, that it felt like physical pain. Zoe, who until then had been engrossed in her drawing, noticed her mother's crying. She got up, went to Diana, and hugged her legs, her small face pressed against her lap. "Don't cry, Mommy," she whispered. Diana hugged her tightly, burying her face in her daughter's blonde hair. "They're happy tears, my love," she managed to say between sobs. "They're the happiest tears of my life." She looked up at Calvin, her eyes red and her face wet. "Sir Calvin, there are no words. How can I ever thank you for this?" "You don't have to," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't expected to feel himself. "Just accept it. Allow the company to thank you both in the only way it knows how. Give Zoe the future she deserves, and give yourself the peace you deserve." Diana nodded, unable to do more. In that moment, sitting in the office of the most powerful man she had ever met, she felt the weight of 2 years of struggle, fear, and desperation simply dissolve. It was a physical sensation, as if a leaden armor she didn't even know she was wearing had disintegrated, leaving her light. For the first time in a very, very long time, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. She didn't feel the panic of the next bill due or the shame of her situation. For the first time in an eternity, as she looked to the future, Diana felt the soft, almost forgotten warmth of relief, and with it, something even rarer and more precious: hope. The weeks between Calvin's offer and Zoe's first day at Blackwood Academy passed in a surreal blur for Diana. They were weeks of firsts she thought she would never experience again. The first time she walked into a bank not to renegotiate a debt, but to close a paid account. The first time she signed an employment contract for an administrative position, her name now associated with a title and a salary that allowed her to breathe. The first time she walked through a children's clothing store and bought a new dress for Zoe, not because the old one was torn, but simply because it was pretty. Each of these moments was a step out of a long, dark tunnel. The sunlight, at first, was almost painfully bright, but slowly her eyes adjusted. The chronic anxiety that lived in her chest like a gnawing animal began to calm, replaced by a feeling she barely recognized: peace. Calvin, for his part, orchestrated everything with the precision of a general planning a campaign. He kept his distance, using Patricia as his intermediary, telling himself he was just managing an investment in human potential. It was a clean, professional phrase that helped him maintain an emotional barrier between himself and the reality of what he was doing. He wasn't just paying bills, he was rebuilding a life. He wasn't just enrolling a child in school, he was opening up the world to her. When the morning of the first day of school finally arrived, a crisp, sunny autumn Monday, Calvin found himself doing something that was not part of any business plan. He cancelled his first meeting of the morning and, instead of heading downtown, drove his luxury sedan to the tree-lined neighborhood where Blackwood Academy was located. He parked at a safe distance under the shade of a century-old oak tree, feeling like a private detective on an absurd mission. He told himself he was just ensuring that the final phase of the project's implementation went smoothly. It was another lie, he told himself. He didn't wait long. Soon, he saw them rounding the corner, walking slowly down the sidewalk. The sight hit him with unexpected force. Zoe was wearing the new dress he knew Diana had bought, a soft blue that matched her eyes. On her back, a new, bright red backpack seemed too big for her small frame. She didn't look intimidated or scared. Her chin was held high, and her bright gaze swept over everything around her with a hungry curiosity, taking in the brick buildings, the wrought iron gates, and the other children. Diana held her hand tightly. She too was wearing new clothes, the ones she had bought for her new job. They were simple but elegant, and for the first time, Calvin saw her not as a figure worn down by hardship, but as the strong, resilient woman she was. There was nervousness in her posture, the protective grip on her hand betraying her anxiety, but there was also an undeniable pride on her face as she looked at her daughter. They were a picture of perfect normalcy, a mother taking her daughter to school on the first day. But Calvin knew the extraordinary journey that had led them to that moment of normalcy. He knew the desperation, the fear, and the courage that hid behind that quiet scene. They stopped in front of the main gate. Diana knelt, adjusting the strap of Zoe's backpack, whispering words Calvin couldn't hear but could imagine. Words of encouragement, of love, of a promising future. Zoe hugged her tightly and then, with a confidence that surprised Calvin, she let go of her mother's hand. She turned and walked towards the gate, without looking back. Diana stood there, watching her go, a solitary figure on the sidewalk. She only moved when Zoe was already through the gate and turned, flashing a radiant smile and waving one last time before disappearing among the other children. Calvin watched the entire scene from inside the silent cocoon of his car, and as he saw the small figure with the red backpack disappear into the schoolyard, the last of his self-imposed barriers crumbled. The pretext of it being a project, an investment, an intellectual curiosity, all of it fell away, revealing the simple, undeniable truth underneath. He was involved, not as a CEO, not as a benefactor, but as himself. He cared, deeply. The anxiety he felt wasn't about an investment going wrong. It was the anxiety for a little girl starting in a new place. The pride he felt wasn't for a successful strategy. It was the pride of seeing her take that brave step. The distance he had cultivated, which once seemed like a position of strength and control, now felt like a form of self-exile. He was on the outside, looking in, and for the first time, he realized with overwhelming clarity that he no longer wanted to be there. He no longer wanted to be distant. The opportunity to break that distance came that same afternoon, unexpectedly. He called Diana at her new extension in the office, under the pretext of asking how Zoe's first day had been. Her voice on the phone was different, lighter and more professional. "It was wonderful, sir." She couldn't stop talking on the way home. "Her art teacher said she has an incredible talent," Diana said, the joy evident in her tone. Suddenly, Calvin heard a commotion in the background, and Zoe's voice, loud and clear. "Is that Calvin? Ask him if he wants to see the drawings I made, and my new room." "He has to see my new room." There was a muffled sound, and Diana came back on the line, her voice now a little embarrassed. "I'm sorry about that, sir. She's excited." Calvin smiled, a genuine and rare reaction. It seems so. He hesitated for a second, then took the plunge. "I'd love to see the drawings. If it's not an imposition, of course." The pause on the other end of the line was long. "No, of course not, sir. It wouldn't be an imposition," Diana said, the hesitation in her voice betraying her surprise. "Do you know where we live?" An hour later, Calvin was driving through a neighborhood that was the opposite of his. The streets were narrower, the buildings were lower, made of brick with fire escapes on the facade. There was a sense of life, of community, that didn't exist in his sterile neighborhood of glass skyscrapers. He found Diana's building, an old but well-maintained structure, and climbed 3 flights of stairs, feeling like an explorer in a foreign land. The door opened before he could even knock. Zoe stood there, her face lit up by a smile. "You came." She pulled him inside, and Calvin entered their world for the first time. The apartment was small, perhaps smaller than his living room. The furniture was old, a mix of time-worn pieces, but the place radiated a warmth that surprised him. The walls, though in need of a new coat of paint, were covered with Zoe's vibrant and colorful drawings, a makeshift art gallery. From the small kitchen came a delicious smell of garlic and basil, the smell of real food being prepared. The kitchen table, clearly the heart of the home, was covered with a checkered tablecloth and a creative mess. Zoe's new school books, sheets of paper with sketches, a jar of pencils, and the report Diana was working on. It was the antithesis of his own glass dining table, always empty and cold. "I'm sorry about the mess," Diana said, coming out of the kitchen, drying her hands on a dish towel. "We kind of live at the table." "Don't apologize, it's great," Calvin said, and he meant it. The place was full of life. He was welcomed with a naturalness that disarmed him. There was none of the formality of their office meetings. Diana served him coffee in a chipped mug that said, "World's Best Mom," and he sat at the kitchen table while Zoe showed him, with infectious enthusiasm, every one of her new school books. He heard the stories about Mrs. Gable, the new teacher, and about the girl named Lily with whom Zoe had shared her snack. He heard Diana laugh, an open and genuine sound he had never heard before, as she told a funny story about a mix-up in her new department. He watched Zoe, who, after showing off her treasures, sat on the floor to draw, humming a soft tune to herself. He did nothing. He didn't give advice, didn't offer solutions, didn't manage anything. He just sat, drank his coffee, and existed in that small, warm, noisy space for an hour. And it was the most real hour he had lived in years. When he finally left, night had fallen. The drive back to his downtown apartment felt like a journey through a portal to another universe. He opened the door to his home, and the contrast hit him like a physical blow. The silence. It was an absolute silence, broken only by the low hum of the climate control system. His apartment was enormous, perfectly designed, with Italian designer furniture and abstract art on the white walls. It was elegant, expensive, and impeccably clean, and it was terribly empty. He stood in the middle of the room, the smell of Diana's tomato sauce still in his memory. He could almost hear her laughter, the sound of Zoe humming. But here there was nothing. No drawings on the walls, no creative mess on the table, no chipped mugs. The silence he had always considered a luxury, a sign of peace and order, now seemed oppressive. The space he saw as a sanctuary of his success now felt like a solitary confinement cell. The silence inside now bothered him, and he knew with an uncomfortable certainty that it was because he had just experienced something that was missing from his perfectly ordered life. The sound of a home. Calvin's home was a sanctuary of silence and order. Every object had its place. Every surface gleamed. Every room was a testament to a life of control and precision. For years, this silence was his refuge, the armor that protected him from the unpredictable chaos of human emotions. But since his visit to Diana and Zoe's small, vibrant apartment, the silence had begun to sound different. It was no longer peaceful. It was empty. That night, the emptiness was particularly deafening. He had spent the late afternoon on a conference call with Tokyo, closing a deal with ruthless efficiency. In the past, a victory like this would have brought him a cold, clear satisfaction. Now, he felt only the echo of his own voice in an empty office. When he got home, the sterile perfection of his apartment seemed to mock him. Restless, he wandered from room to room, adjusting a book that was already straight, straightening a painting that wasn't crooked. It was an old ritual, an attempt to impose order on his environment when his inner world was in disarray. His steps led him to his home office, a space dominated by a large desk of solid oak, an heirloom from his grandfather. It was the only piece of furniture in the entire house that had history, that had warmth. Everything else was modern, metal and glass. He ran his hand over the worn wood, his gaze lost on the wall, and then his focus landed on the bottom drawer on the right side, the drawer that stuck, the drawer he hadn't opened in years. He hadn't kept it locked with a key, but with something much stronger, the deliberate refusal to acknowledge its existence. That night, however, something was different. Driven by a force he didn't fully understand, he grasped the brass handle. He pulled. The drawer resisted, as always. It was as if the wood itself remembered the order to keep its secrets hidden. He pulled harder, the muscle in his forearm tensing. With a drawn-out, reluctant groan, the drawer gave way, sliding open for the first time in nearly a decade. The air that came out was old and still, smelling of paper, time, and stored memories. The contents were a graveyard of a past life. There was a crumpled ticket from a jazz festival, a small seashell they had found on a beach, an instant photo of him and a blonde woman laughing, their faces flushed from the sun. Adele, seeing her smile was still like a punch to the gut. And underneath it all there was the envelope. It was made of expensive, thick, cream-colored paper. His name, Calvin's, was written on the front in her elegant, slanted handwriting, a handwriting he once dreamed of seeing on wedding invitations. He didn't need to open it. Every word was seared into his memory like a branding iron. He picked up the envelope, the texture of the paper strangely familiar in his fingers. And as he held it, the present dissolved, and he was transported back to the day he found it. It was less than 48 hours before the wedding. The apartment they shared was immaculate, ready for the avalanche of relatives arriving the next day. His tuxedo, perfectly pressed, hung on the closet door, The 2 platinum wedding bands were in a velvet box on the dresser. Everything was in its place, while everything was under control. But Adele wasn't there when he got home from work. He called her cell phone, voicemail. He assumed she was with her mother, sorting out some last-minute detail. But as the hours passed, a cold anxiety began to seep into his veins. It wasn't like her not to call. He searched the apartment for her, his heart beating a heavy, unfamiliar rhythm. That's when he went into their bedroom and saw it. The letter. Placed perfectly in the center of the bed they had chosen together. He remembered standing still for a long moment, just staring at the envelope, knowing that whatever was inside would shatter his perfectly constructed world. He remembered the feeling of his fingers trembling as he opened it, and then the words, so few words to cause so much destruction. I'm sorry. I don't know what I want anymore. I can't go through with this. That was it. No explanation, no reason he could analyze, dissect and solve. Just a void. For a man like Calvin, whose entire life was dedicated to understanding the why and how of everything, that lack of logic was a form of torture. What did he do wrong? What did he miss? The questions haunted him for months, but the letter offered no answers, only the chaos of an emotion he couldn't quantify. The pain of that abandonment was seismic. It wasn't just a broken heart. It was the annihilation of his faith in the order of the universe. If something so certain, so planned, so contracted as a wedding could disintegrate without reason, then nothing was safe, and so he shut down. He took all that pain, all that confusion, and channeled it into the one thing in his life that still made sense. Work. Business had clear rules. Effort led to results. Contracts were honored. He built Magnus Enterprises like a fortress around himself, brick by brick of success, until the walls were so high that no one else could get in. Friendships became superficial. Relationships, non-existent. He became the CEO, the boss, the architect of his own silent empire. And it worked. He became immune to pain, but in the process, he also became immune to joy. Back in the present, Calvin looked at the letter in his hand, the paper yellowed with age. The pain was still there, an old ember that had never completely gone out. But something had changed. The memory of Adele, of that chaotic abandonment, was no longer the only presence in his silence. His mind conjured a different image, the image of Diana's kitchen table, covered in books and drawings. The image of Zoe seriously explaining the rules of her puzzle game. The image of Diana's tired but genuine smile as she watched him drink coffee from her chipped mug. He contrasted the two realities. Adele's departure was an act of confusion, a mystery that left him powerless. Diana's presence, on the other hand, was based on a brutal clarity. She fought for reasons he understood: survival, love for her daughter. There was no chaos in her actions, only extraordinary strength. And Zoe was the opposite of the vacuum Adele had left. The girl was a force of nature, full of questions, laughter, and a bewildering logic that, instead of creating chaos, seemed to impose a new kind of order on his life. He looked again at Adele's handwriting, and then glanced at the corner of his desk, where one of Zoe's drawings was kept. It was the drawing of him with a stick-figure smile. The warmth he felt when he was near them wasn't the dangerous vertigo he had felt with Adele. It was something calmer, more solid. It didn't threaten his world. In fact, it seemed to make it less gray, less silent. He realized that, for the first time in nearly a decade, he was letting people in, even just a little, through the cracks in his fortress. And the world hadn't collapsed. He slowly folded Adele's letter and placed it back in the bottom of the drawer. He didn't tear it up. It was part of his history, the scar that had shaped him. But for the first time, it didn't feel like the end of his story. It just felt like a chapter. As he closed the drawer, the sound of the wood settling seemed final. A period at the end of an era in his life. He didn't know what the future held. He couldn't name the feeling that was growing in his chest for this mother and her daughter. But standing in the silence of his office, he felt a spark of something he thought was dead forever. With Diana and Zoe, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he could try again. Not to start over, but to continue. He could try to feel again. The transformation in Calvin's life was not a single, thunderous event, but a series of small surrenders. The first was the surrender of his time. The visits to Diana and Zoe's apartment, which began as calculated expeditions into unknown territory, gradually merged into the very fabric of his weeks. The excuse of monitoring the investment in Zoe was the first to disappear, replaced by a simpler honesty. He went because he wanted to be there. The ritual usually began with a text message sent around 4 in the afternoon, when the energy in his office started to wane, and the prospect of returning to his silent apartment seemed less a relief and more a sentence. Leaving soon. Does Zoe need help with any homework today? The question was a formality. Diana's response, almost always, was an open invitation. The door's open. And the coffee's almost ready. And so Calvin, a man whose days were dictated by a military-precise electronic schedule, found himself surrendering to a new kind of timetable, one governed by the smell of brewed coffee, the sound of colored pencils on paper, and the peculiar logic of a 7-year-old girl. Helping Zoe with her homework became the first of these rituals. Calvin, too, who could analyze a 100-page financial statement and find a discrepancy in under 5 minutes, found himself completely inept when faced with the challenges of elementary education. The math was simple, but the word problems were a labyrinth of absurd scenarios about farmers with disproportionate animals. History was factual, but Zoe's interpretation was anarchic and full of compassion for forgotten historical figures. The biggest challenge, however, was creative writing. On a Tuesday afternoon, he found her staring at a blank sheet of paper with fierce intensity. "What's the problem?" he asked, sitting at the kitchen table, which now had an unofficially reserved spot for him. "The essay," sighed Zoe, pointing to the topic at the top of the page. "What is courage?" Mrs. Gable said to think of examples. "Excellent," said Calvin, slipping into his problem-solving mode. We can talk about soldiers, firefighters, explorers who faced the unknown." Zoe shook her head, unsatisfied. "That's easy. It's their job to be brave." She looked at him with her serious, penetrating eyes. "Is Mommy brave?" The question caught him off guard. He glanced at Diana, who was in the small kitchen making dinner, lost in her own world. He thought about her story, the quiet strength with which she had faced abandonment, debt, fear. "Yes, Zoe," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Your mom is the bravest person I know." Zoe smiled, satisfied, and began to write. Calvin stood there watching her and realized that in his entire business life he had confused risk with courage. Zoe, with a single question, had taught him the difference. The second ritual was movie night on Fridays. It became a sacred and immutable institution. Calvin, who was accustomed to business dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, now looked forward to pepperoni pizza eaten from paper plates on Diana's worn-out couch. The movie selection was Zoe's, a deep dive into the colorful and emotional world of the Korean animations that had taught her so much. He learned the characters' names, cheered for the heroes, and even shed a discreet tear when a forest spirit sacrificed itself to save the village. Sitting in the dark, with the glow of the screen illuminating the faces beside him, he felt miles away from the CEO of Magnus Enterprises. Here, he wasn't a boss or a benefactor. He was just Calvin, the guy who always let Zoe have the last slice of pizza. On these nights, the dynamic with Diana deepened. They would sit with Zoe between them, a buffer and a bridge. While the girl was immersed in the movie, they shared a comfortable silence. Sometimes their shoulders would touch and neither would pull away. Sometimes, during a funny scene, their eyes would meet over Zoe's head, and they would share a silent, knowing smile. They were tiny, almost imperceptible interactions, but they were building a foundation of familiarity and trust. The conversation flowed more easily in the moments after the movie, after Zoe had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted. With the apartment plunged into semi-darkness, they would sit at the kitchen table, the glow of the city lights coming through the window, and they would talk. That's how the third ritual began, the sharing of stories. Not the big, painful truths yet, but the small fragments that make up a life. He learned that the smell of freshly cut grass reminded her of her father, that she had an irrational fear of butterflies, and that she dreamed of one day visiting Greece. She learned that he was a terrible cook, that he read historical biographies to relax, and that as a boy he wanted to be an architect, to build things that would last. Every little revelation was a thread, and without realizing it, they were weaving a tapestry of connection, a fabric of mutual understanding that was strong and real. Calvin found himself thinking about these conversations during board meetings, Diana's smile popping into his mind when an executive said something particularly absurd. He didn't dare name what he was feeling, but it was a constant presence. The feeling that his center of gravity had shifted from his 40th floor office to that small living room full of drawings. That home, those two, they were becoming a part of him. The life he had built, so carefully controlled and isolated, now had a door that opened to warmth, and he found himself walking through it more and more often. The culmination of this silent transformation came on a Saturday afternoon. Rain was falling outside, a steady, soft sound that insulated the small apartment from the rest of the world. Zoe was happy in her room, the sound of her building blocks and her whispered narration creating a gentle soundtrack for the day. Calvin and Diana were in the living room, reading, a scene of domesticity so peaceful it was almost frightening to Calvin. Diana lowered her book, her gaze lost in the rain. "The rain always makes me feel nostalgic," she said softly. "It makes you remember who you used to be." The simple observation opened a door. The conversation that followed was different. They didn't talk about distant childhoods or future dreams, but about the wounds that had shaped them, the scars they still carried. With a calm that only time and acceptance can bring, Diana spoke about the end of her marriage. "I replayed that last day 1,000,000 times in my head," she said, her voice a murmur. "The coffee cup he left half empty in the sink, the way he gave me a goodbye kiss that felt no different from all the others. There were no signs, and that was the cruelest part. The absence of a why. It made me question everything. If I couldn't see that the man I slept next to every night was about to erase me from his life, how could I trust my own judgment about anything else?" Calvin listened, and her every word was an echo of his own pain. Her experience validated his in a way that years of expensive therapy never could. The feeling of being left behind without a map, without a logical reason, was a terrain he knew all too well. "I know what you mean," he said, his voice hoarse, and, for the first time, he spoke about Adele to someone other than his reflection in the mirror. "She left me a letter, 3 sentences. The worst part was, I don't know what I want anymore. How do you respond to that? I built my entire life knowing exactly what I wanted. The concept of simply not knowing was a foreign language. I couldn't fight it. I couldn't fix it. So I did the only thing I knew how. I buried it under work. I decided work was safer." Emotions were too risky a variable. They sat in silence, the sound of the rain filling the space between their confessions. They were two people who had chosen different paths to deal with the same kind of abandonment. She, forced to fight in the real world for her daughter. He, retreating into a self-imposed fortress. In that space of raw honesty, Calvin felt a truth that had been growing inside him overflow. It was a terrifying truth, because it was vulnerable, but he could no longer contain it. "I didn't realize when it happened," he began, his voice so low Diana had to lean in to hear, a restrained voice fighting against the weight of a long suppressed emotion. But I've grown attached to your daughter, Diana." He looked at his own hands, unable to meet her gaze. "After Adele, I locked myself away, threw away the key. Feeling anything felt like a risk I couldn't take anymore. It was easier to be the CEO, to be the boss, to be a function, not a person. And then this 7-year-old girl walks into my boardroom and, without any effort, starts taking down every brick I put in place." He gave a sad, humorless smile. "She dismantled me, with her questions about rice cakes and happiness, with the way she just assumes people are good. She knows nothing about my walls, so she just walks right through them. She made me trust something again. She made me feel, and I was terrified of it." The confession hung in the air, fragile and iridescent. He had shed his armor, exposing the core of his loneliness and the unexpected healing he had found in that home. Diana watched him for a long moment, the empathy in her eyes as deep as an ocean. She said nothing. Instead, she stood up, walked to his armchair, and hesitating for only an instant, reached out and placed her hand on his. The touch was light, warm, and incredibly steady. It wasn't a gesture of romance, nor of pity. It was a gesture of recognition, from one survivor to another. "She feels it too," Diana said, her voice soft and full of certainty. "We feel it." The "we" enveloped Calvin like a warm blanket. It was an acceptance and a confirmation that he was not alone in his feelings, that the bond he felt was real and reciprocated. She saw him, not as the billionaire who had changed her life, but as the man who sat at her table and laughed at her daughter's stories. She withdrew her hand and returned to her seat. The tension did not return. In its place, a new layer of peace settled in the room. The truth had been spoken, vulnerability had been shared, and instead of breaking, the bond between them only grew stronger. In that moment, in that silent room with the sound of the rain outside, there was no romance. There was something deeper, forged in the fire of loss and tempered by empathy. There was truth, and there was a mutual respect that formed the most solid of foundations. Saturday morning arrived with the soft, golden light that promised a day without rush. In Diana's small apartment, the air was a mix of sweet and comforting smells. The gentle sizzle of pancake batter hitting the hot pan was the soundtrack, punctuated by the rhythmic and precise sound of Zoe's scissors cutting through old magazine pages at her kitchen table, which served as the hub for all activities. Diana hummed an out-of-tune melody, her body swaying gently as she flipped the pancakes. The stress that once marked her shoulders with a permanent tension had vanished, replaced by a lightness that seemed to rejuvenate her features. The knock on the door was so light and familiar that neither of them flinched. It wasn't the formal knock of a guest, but the knock of someone coming home. Zoe looked up from her cutouts, an instant smile spreading across her face. "Hey, it's Calvin," she announced, as if it were the most anticipated event of the day. Diana smiled, turning from the stove as Calvin walked in, closing the door behind him. He didn't look like a billionaire in a modest apartment. He just looked like a man entering a home on a Saturday morning. He was carrying 2 paper bags from the farmer's market held in the park on Saturdays. "Good morning," he said, his smile easy and genuine. He placed the bags on the already crowded counter. "I got your favorite fruits." He unwrapped a basket of bright red strawberries, Zoe's favorite, and another of dark blueberries for Diana. The gesture was simple, but laden with meaning. He didn't just bring a gift. He brought something that showed attentiveness, a knowledge of the small details that made up their lives. "You didn't have to do that, Calvin," Diana said, though the warmth in her voice showed her gratitude. "I know," he replied, and the simplicity of the answer said it all. He didn't do it because he had to, but because he wanted to. With the ease of someone who knows the territory, he moved around the small kitchen. He opened the cupboard, took out the dark blue ceramic mug that had tacitly become his, and poured himself some of the coffee Diana had just brewed. He opened the small drawer next to the sink, got the sugar bowl and put a spoonful in his drink, all without hesitation. Every movement was a silent testament to his integration into that space. He was no longer a stranger who needed guidance. He knew the maps and rhythms of that home. "Calvin, come see," Zoe called from the table, pointing to the collage she was creating. "It's a treasure map for Mr. Kimchi." He walked over, coffee in hand, and examined the tangle of cut-out images. "That looks like a very difficult treasure to find," he observed seriously. "He's going to need a boat." "I know, I'm making one out of this cereal box." Diana placed a plate with a stack of pancakes in front of him, next to Zoe's cutouts. He sat down, and the moment felt like the most natural thing in the world. The 3 of them gathered around the table, the smell of coffee and pancakes, the creative clutter of a child, the morning sunlight. Diana watched him for a moment, the way he already seemed to be part of the furniture, and an amused smile played on her lips. "This has become a routine, huh?" she teased him gently. He looked up from the treasure map and met her gaze, her smile mirroring his. "It's considerably more interesting than my Saturday spreadsheets," he admitted, "and the pancakes are better." The morning unfolded at a slow, comfortable pace. After breakfast, while Diana cleaned the kitchen, Zoe pulled Calvin's hand towards the living room. "The puzzle," she announced. "We're at the hardest part." On the floor, scattered across the colorful rug, were the hundreds of pieces of a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. It was a complex image of a botanical garden, a nightmare of green tones and floral patterns. Calvin, the man who saw patterns in global financial markets, sat on the floor and faced the challenge. They worked together. Zoe, with her eagle eyes, was the piece hunter, finding the most unlikely shapes and colors in the midst of the chaos. Calvin was the strategist, organizing pieces by color, identifying the edges, and assembling small sections of the image that could later be connected. Diana joined them, and for over an hour, they were nothing but three people focused on a single goal, their hands occasionally crossing as they searched for the perfect piece. There were moments of frustration, groans when a piece seemed right but wasn't, and small exclamations of victory. And there was laughter. Calvin laughed, an open, relaxed sound he barely recognized as his own, when Zoe tried to fit a tulip piece into the middle of a koi pond. On that floor, surrounded by cardboard pieces and their warm presence, he felt more content than in any boardroom. Later, with the puzzle partially conquered, the afternoon energy began to wane. Zoe, tired of searching for shades of green, grabbed one of her favorite books and snuggled up next to Calvin on the couch. "Read to me," she asked, her voice already sleepy. He took the book, a story about a star who was afraid of the dark. He began to read, and his voice, normally used to command and persuade, softened, adopting different tones for the different characters. He read about the little star's journey, about finding courage, and about the importance of her friends, the moon and the comets. He could feel the warm weight of Zoe leaning against his arm, her breathing becoming slower and deeper as the story progressed. Looking at her face, so serene and trusting in his presence, Calvin felt a wave of affection so powerful it almost took his breath away. The afternoon turned to dusk. The city lights began to twinkle outside the window, and Zoe was sleeping soundly on the couch. It was time for him to go. He stood up carefully, and Diana helped him place a blanket over the girl. They stood in silence for a moment at the door, the apartment quiet around them. "Thank you for today," Diana said softly. "She loves it when you're here." "I love being here too," Calvin replied, and the honesty in his voice was total. He looked at the agenda in his mind, at the Sunday stretching before him, a day that would normally be filled with work or the silence of his apartment, and he made a decision. "I can bring that new book about space I promised her tomorrow," he said. He paused, a remnant of his old hesitation showing, "And if you'd like, I can try to make my famous lasagna for dinner." The offer hung in the air. It wasn't an invitation to go out, but a request to come in even further, to cook in her kitchen, to share a meal not as someone who brings pizza, but as someone who prepares the food. It was a step towards an even greater intimacy, and he was, in a way, asking for permission. Diana looked at him, and in her eyes there was a tenderness and understanding that warmed him from the inside out. A slow, genuine smile formed on her lips. She didn't say yes, she didn't say we'd love that. She said something much more significant. "Calvin," she said, her voice soft but firm as a rock. "Here, you don't have to ask." The words hit him, simple, direct, and profound. They weren't just an invitation, they were a declaration, a confirmation of his place. A visitor asks, a guest inquires, but he was no longer either of those. He smiled, a slow smile that reached his eyes. "See you tomorrow, Diana. See you tomorrow." He left and closed the door slowly, the soft click of the latch sealing the promise. As he walked down the stairs, Diana's words echoed in his mind. "Here, you don't have to ask." He stopped on the sidewalk, the cool night air on his face, and looked up at the lit window of their third-floor apartment. A sense of peace and certainty settled over him, a clarity he had never felt before. All his previous relationships had been based on plans, on expectations, on requests and permissions. But this was different. It had grown organically, quietly, until it had become an undeniable part of his existence. Now he knew. What he did when he went there wasn't a visit. The time he spent with them wasn't a favor or a distraction. He wasn't on the periphery of their lives, looking in. He was a part of the puzzle mess, part of the bedtime stories, part of the smell of coffee on Saturday mornings, part of that small, noisy and wonderful universe they had